Okay, so just a little bit of clarity for anyone who's not certain. Turnitin is web-based software that maps or matches submitted student work to text in its database. When we talk about Turnitin casually in the university context, you will often hear people refer to Turnitin as plagiarism software. It's not. We use it to detect similarities between the work that a student has submitted and work that exists in the Turnitin database, but that does not necessarily imply that a student has plagiarized. We will talk a little bit later when we're talking about the interpretation of a Turnitin report about how difficult it is to necessarily impute malicious plagiarism simply from similarities in text. And so I do just want to emphasize that while it matches what a student has written to what exists in its database, we need to read that report quite cautiously. And we need to read that report with an understanding that all that the software is doing is saying this piece of text looks exactly like this piece of text. What Turnitin does is it doesn't function on a holistic perspective. So it doesn't look at the assignment as a whole. It looks at simply strings of words inside that assignment. So to give you an example, in my context, I automatically ask Turnitin not to count words like 3 subsequent words. So if a student has 3 subsequent words and that matches some 3 subsequent words somewhere in the database or the internet, I ask Turnitin not to count that. And in fact, I usually go up to 5 words because in my context, what I often have a problem with is my students use the phrase learning and teaching or teaching and learning an awful lot. And Turnitin would flag those every single time they used it. And it would make it very difficult for me to see where there was really genuinely some form of plagiarism occurring. And so it's worth bearing in mind that it's just a very, in some ways, fundamentally a matching software. So there was a question a little while ago about Turnitin's repositories, and the Turnitin database, the repository that they use, consists of live and archived internet documents. So anything on the internet, anything that has been on the internet for some period of time. Because this is proprietary, Turnitin does not tell you exactly which archived versions of the internet that they use. So we don't have direct understanding of how many years of data they have, for example. And that might in future have a consequence for what it can reliably match to. Papers previously submitted to Turnitin from your own or other institutions. I had a student's paper come back to me the other day with a 34% matching similarity index. That's what Turnitin calls it, a similarity index. And when I went and looked at it, it matched another student text in another institution. But when I dug one step deeper into it, what it gave me was that, in fact, both these students had used a third-party text. So they had both referred to a particular journal article. And what the students were in both cases struggling with was not plagiarism so much as being able to rewrite the words of that text. There were some phrases that had kind of lurked around and made it quite difficult for them to rephrase or paraphrase. So papers previously submitted to Turnitin from your own or other institutions. And then finally, Turnitin has access to certain, not all, paid for publications. So that is something that we need to consider. The Turnitin database is very specific. Obviously, if a student has hand copied from another student's handwritten tutorial, that Turnitin's not going to be able to help us there. If a student is submitting to you online something that they've copied of a paper-based version from somebody else, Turnitin's not going to be able to detect that. If your student is submitting work that comes from another human being, what is referred to sometimes in the literature as contract cheating. So a student has asked someone else, a friend, somebody to write a paper for them and submits that, and that they submit that to you as their own work. Turnitin will obviously not be able to catch that or identify that in any way. And so you're going to not know whether or not that student has, based on the Turnitin report, whether or not the student has actually submitted work that is their own. So for me, a question that we need to understand and think about very carefully as we go into this conversation is the question of what is the limits of Turnitin. And the limits of Turnitin is that it is simply matching software that allows us to identify that this student's text is the same as this piece of text in the database. That's all. When we submit a document to Turnitin, we receive in return a Turnitin originality report. We tend to just call them Turnitin reports. And what that does is it highlights any pieces of text that match anything in the database. Okay, we're going to look at one of these reports shortly. Before I go any further, any questions, any comments on what I've said so far? So Turnitin is an incredibly useful tool for matching student writing or for identifying any matches in a student's writing to text outside in the world, but it does have limitations and we should actually pay attention to those. Also within the Turnitin suite, you'll notice when we head across there is that there are different tools hiding in the Turnitin suite. So when you head into Turnitin, you will both see your similarity report. That's this little red box at the top. You'll be able to see that. You'll also be able to see a quick marks tool, a feedback tool, a tool for creating rubrics, and a tool for giving students simply communicating directly a comment to students. So all of that also sits in your Turnitin tool. The other thing that sits in the Turnitin tool, I'm sorry, which is not currently on this screen, is Turnitin's AI detector, which is something that people are very interested in. They market it as an AI detector, as is the case with the matching scenario. We do need to work quite cautiously with how we understand that particular framing. In the current context, so UCT 2024, many of the additional Turnitin functionality that you see on the screen at the moment, so specifically the voice and text comments, the rubric tool, Amatuba has native/internal built-in versions of those tools as well. So you might not always go to the Turnitin grading suite to access those. The one tool that's currently not there is the Quick Marks tool, but that is something that hopefully in time will be available to us. It's not something that's clear right now though, but for now, the voice comment, the video comment, the text comment, and the rubrics tool are directly available to us in Amatuba. So you don't necessarily have to Turnitin for those unless that's something that you absolutely want to do. Okay, one of the things that people ask about often in relation to Turnitin is, can I use Turnitin for review and research purposes? I.e., can I use Turnitin for my own research? I've written a paper and I want to just make sure that I haven't inadvertently plagiarized. Please don't use Turnitin for those purposes. For those purposes, there is a very lovely tool called Authenticate. Authenticate works similarly to Turnitin, but it's licensed differently. And you can gain access to it via the ICTS help desk. They license it per use, I believe, rather than across the institution as a whole. But staff have free access to it. So if you are looking to, let's say you're reviewing a paper that's been sent to you and you want to put it through Authenticate, you can simply contact the help desk. They'll give you a link. You head across there, you enter your details, and you can submit the paper to that. If you want to do the same with your own research, it works exactly the same way. You simply contact ICTS, etc., and follow that process. The exception to this is I do not recommend that you use Authenticate for supervision purposes. For supervision purposes, the process is a little bit different. And this is something that is probably of interest both to librarians and lecturing staff. In most instances, each faculty will have, for supervision purposes, a site to which a master's, a PhD student may submit any version of their thesis up to and specifically required to the final version. Okay, so for example, in the humanities, there is a master's site which your student has access to. You don't have access to it directly because it would just be far too noisy for most staff. The student may submit any piece of their work to that they wish, that is for their master's dissertation, and they should only submit it to that site. So they shouldn't submit it anywhere else because otherwise it will throw up replications and very high Turnitin scores. But they can submit their proposal to that. They can submit their chapter 1. They can submit chapter 1 and 2. They can submit just chapter 3. It's entirely up to you how you use that site. What the student will receive is their full Turnitin report for that particular site, and they can download that and bring it to a conversation with their supervisor. As a supervisor, accessing that site is probably less than desirable because every single master student in your faculty will have access to it. They submit on different schedules, and what you don't want in a kind of supervisor position is constantly being pinged by the various, every time there's activity on that site. So just be aware that neither Turnitin nor Authenticate in a conventional site is a good option for somebody who wants to check on how's my master's student doing with regards to, for example, excessively quoting or quoting without proper textual conventions like inverted commas and a citation. Um, Karen, I know you had a question specifically about this. Is there anything there that you want to follow up on before we continue?
No, I think that's quite clear. So this is when Turnitin is part of Vula or Amatuba, for example,
Yes,
then that will be a separate site for the
it's a
students.
separate site for the students. And from a supervision practice point of view, I think it's probably a good idea, particularly if you feel like your student is struggling with paraphrasing, struggling with kind of finding their own voice and their own way of phrasing things, that you ask them to do that with each chapter. Um, if you see chapters along the way, or you ask them to do that with, a couple of, like at least a few times prior to final submission, because what we do often see is we see students who prior to a big submission date, like the fee rebate dates, we'll often see students suddenly in a flurry submitting to Turnitin because they want to try and make the Monday submission or whatever it is. And then they come back with sometimes quite high Turnitin scores and then find themselves not understanding that this is something that has been a persistent problem. So I would encourage you to encourage students to submit as often as makes sense for your writing schedule.
And then for honors students, I think that should actually be the first level where it's
Yep,
introduced, because that's when they start to actually do
absolutely.
research. Yeah.
So with honors students, there's usually a course code for the honors submission, and there is nothing to stop a department setting up with that course code, just setting up an assignment within a particular course. So perhaps that course code runs the whole year for an honors group or the second half of the year, whatever makes sense for your program. And you simply set up an assignment, which is what we're going to do. I'm going to demo for you now. Set up an assignment, enable a Turnitin link for that, and then as many students as want to submit can submit to that as many times as you would like them to. So whoever is convening your honors program for the course or for whoever's convening the honors program for the department, that might be a useful thing to just ask, have a conversation about, suggest. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, cool. So folks, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dip into Turnitin and I'm just going to show you where this lives because I think it is something that is best understood in context. I'm sorry, this is my sandbox, so it's just a site that I have to play around in. You can always request a sandbox for yourself if you're somebody who's doing some site design and want to see it out of sight of your students. So you would go simply to Amatuba and then you would click on your little waffle icon, and that would bring you to your site names. And I've gone straight to Shonali Sandbox. And in Amatuba, the Turnitin tool is attached to assignments already. In the same way that it was in Vula, it was kind of a choice option there, and it is here as well. So we're going to go to activities, down arrow, and we're going to go to assignments. That's one way to access the assignments tool. Others may prefer to go manage course, download, course admin, and look for the assignments tool here. It's also very findable there. I'm just going to go to it the shortcut way because life. Okay, and on this site at the moment, I don't have any assignments, so I'm going to talk you through what that would look like. So from scratch, what you're looking at here is you would build a new assignment, and I imagine the assignment building part is something that people have had some experience of in the past. Please slow me down if I go too quickly through any of this and you don't see it. So this is going to be, I'm going to give it a title, and I'm going to call it Turnitin Example for now so that I remember what it's about. You would have an option here to say graded or ungraded. For now, I'm going to just say that it's out of 100 marks for the sake of my own sanity. And you would have a number of different choices. Now, typically in Vula, these menus that are here on the right-hand side were horizontal across the top of your screen or vertical down the side here. But in Amatuba, they're just arranged on the side here. And your Turnitin option is hiding under evaluation and feedback. Okay, so if I go and click on this little drop down menu arrow, you can see that I have to scroll all the way to the bottom for the Turnitin option. And if I click Manage Turnitin, it gives me a starting point for some questions that I need to answer. And to enable me to click on any of these pale gray items, I first need to simply click this button at the top that says Enable Similarity Report for this folder. And then it will give me, you'll see that those got a bit darker. I will then need to make some choices based on these options they give me. So the first one is display, and it's asking me, do I want learners to see the similarity scores in their submission folder? And I always say yes, because I think my students should have access to that information about their own writing. It allows them to understand why we have comments or questions. It allows them to perhaps work a bit more proactively in some ways, which we'll talk about shortly. You have a choice here as to whether you want to automatically check for similarity on all submissions. What that means is that every student gets a similarity report. Alternatively, you can identify individual submissions for similarity checking. At UCT, the current accepted practice is to simply leave it on automatic similarity checking for all submissions, i.e. we treat all of our students the same in this regard and everybody gets a similarity score. There are institutions where people would say that only if they have a question about student writing will they enable individual submission checking. I think that opens you up to all sorts of questions about why the student. And so I think it's simply easier and possibly more defensible to say that we're going to check all submissions. You have an option to enable Turnitin's grading tools for that particular folder. If you do so, that's kind of a separate grading question. We're not going to look into that in too much detail today, but you could do that. I find that at the moment, I think the Amatuba marking suite is quite comprehensive, and so I'm not marking in Turnitin at all at the moment. If you are accustomed to marking and Turnitin, please feel free to enable that little radio box there. What is important though is to go to the More Options button and click on that. Because there are a series of choices here that you need to make and just understand. So the first choice is, do you submit papers? Where do you submit them? Okay, in some cases, lecturers will not store the submitted papers. So perhaps this is a draft submission and you are going to have it's a version 1 and you're going to have students resubmit later on. Perhaps in that case, you do not want to store the submitted papers because you don't want them to compare to each other. In many cases, though, the normal practice is to store all papers in the standard repository. If you do not store papers on an assignment, it means that that is no longer part of the database. What that means is if a student from, say, 2023 shares an assignment with a student from 2024, you will not have that 2023 data in the database to compare your 2024 student to. So generally, it's a good idea to store copies of all assignments in the standard paper repository, unless there's an exceptionally good reason, like this is a draft submission, to not store that paper. Okay. Automatically submitted within the UCT context is we allow files of any type, and that we allow late submissions to be submitted to the repository. You can, of course, you set your dates in your you set the acceptable dates for submissions in the assignment tab rather than here. You can enable grammar checking and it will produce a report on that. You can also, if you wish, attach a rubric. I would not do this through here because you can do this directly to the assignment itself rather than through the Turnitin questions. And then there's a series of questions about the similarity report. This is a place where it's worth thinking about the process around the writing. So you have an option for reports to generate immediately, but students cannot resubmit. You have another option, which is that Turnitin will generate reports immediately, but students can only resubmit until the due and students can resubmit until the due date. We have a little bit of a time lag on this, which is after the first 3 submissions, reports will only generate every 24 hours. And then your third option, which is that the reports are generated on the due date and students can only submit until that particular date. So let's talk through some of the constraints and affordances of that. In the first instance, if you generate reports immediately, but students cannot resubmit, what that means is your students will be able to see exactly what grade they received, but what they will not have an option, they will be able to see what report they received, but they will not have an option to go back and change that and resubmit a new text. Okay, this works acceptably for staff who don't want their students to have a chance to paraphrase or to rewrite or to edit their text. In courses where it's a what you submitted is what I grade kind of scenario, this works really well. On the other hand, in some courses, there is a developmental aspect to the writing, and we want students to look at their text, see that certain things have been flagged as problematic, and then edit or change those things. And then that first option, option 1, doesn't work so well. Option 2 tends to work better. So with option 2, your student can resubmit multiple times, and they will get a report immediately. In Turnitin terms can have a slight lag. So usually an hour or 2 later, your report arrives. Sometimes it can be much faster than that. It just depends on I guess, traffic through their servers at any given moment. This particular option 2 works really well in instances where there is a developmental approach to writing within the course, where we want our students to submit early, look at the report, change their document, edit their document, and resubmit. And the reason we have the 3 submission mark is what we would not like students to do is submit, fix a minor problem, submit, fix a minor problem, submit, fix a minor problem. Rather, what we would like them to do is to really engage with what is going on with their writing. So they get 3 quick resubmissions, and after that, it kind of slows them down a little bit. So that prevents students from doing that kind of just trying different things and seeing if it works to change the similarity index. And then the last one allows students a very limited amount of time, essentially, to improve their text. So they can submit very early in the morning, get a report within sort of a couple of hours of that, and then resubmit thereafter. So that gives them a fairly limited window to make changes, which is absolutely fine, again, depending on what your particular course context is and what it is that you would like to achieve in your writing space. Are there any questions about any of the settings that I've discussed so far? Any questions about any of those settings? Okay. Please feel free to unmute at any point and ask any questions. I'm very happy to answer them. Okay, the next step is around translated matching, and specifically what Turnitin does is that it will match your student's text to a selection of texts in other languages. So there on the screen at the moment is a list of the following languages. So it will compare it to texts in those languages. So what that does is it tends to reduce the opportunity for students to simply find a text in a different language and translate that into the language that of learning and teaching. So it reduces the opportunity of, for example, a student finding a text in Mandarin, for example, or finding a text in Hindi or finding a text in French and translating that back into the language that they are being examined in. Apologies, folks. I want to just make myself go back to where I was. Sorry, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Apologies. I will go back to sharing screen in one sec. Okay. So just be aware that that is something that you can consider. It depends on how likely that is in your particular context as to whether or not you want to enable that. And then these are quite useful boxes to consider ticking. So I would definitely exclude bibliographic materials, things that are in titles and the references. Journal names and references can artificially and unnecessarily inflate your student's similarity index, so I tend to take those away. Similarly, I exclude quoted materials. So if my student has legitimately quoted and followed the academic conventions, i.e. inverted commas as appropriate, an in-text reference and an item on the reference list, then I'm very happy to not consider those, because as I'm marking, I will notice if they do that excessively and comment on it. And then you need to make a choice about excluding what Turnitin calls small sources. I have never successfully found a percentage that works, simply because if you're doing a 300 word piece versus 1,500, that percentage is going to shift quite a lot. And so I simply say exclude everything up to 5 words in a row. In some disciplines, people won't do this. They'll just leave it at 0 and not exclude small sources. I just think that often um, I don't want phrases that are common in my discipline being a reason for an unnecessarily inflated matching index. So I'll exclude up to 5 words. And then you can tell them what you want to compare against. The automatic settings for UCT is that each of those are selected, but you could, for example, say that you want to only compare against the student repository or any combination of these that you wanted. Okay. Obviously, if you untick all of those, there's nothing to compare it to, and then you won't have a very successful similarity report. You can also choose to exclude any attached material, such as a declaration of authenticity or um, a front page. You could upload these if you want those to be excluded, and you can save those settings for future use so that you don't have to rethink this each time. And then you can simply click submit and save, and that set of settings is now attached to this particular assignment in Amatuba. Okay, before we go any further, is there anything here that people have comments, questions, thoughts about? I'm just going to go save and close. Okay, give me 10 seconds, folks. I'm just going to pull up the right slides and then take you into those for the last bit of our content. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about attaching this to an Amatuba site and how to ensure that your settings are correct. So I'm not going to dip into that anymore. You need to, as I've already indicated, just a reminder that you need to think a little bit about your process around the use of Turnitin. Are you going to limit submissions to a once-off situation or to a resubmit situation? And depending on what you opt for, whether it's for Vula or for Amatuba, you need to make a decision about whether to allow for resubmission based on the conversation we've already had about those options that are available to you. We've talked a little bit about the settings already, so I'm not going to get into those in very much detail. What I do want to spend a few minutes thinking about is how to interpret Turnitin reports. Okay, so Turnitin reports will produce a similarity index for you, and I'm going to go pull up a report in a second for us to have a look at together. But they will produce a similarity index for you, and that similarity index will simply be a number. Okay, so you will end up with somewhere from 0 to 100 as a similarity index, a similarity number. And if that number is either incredibly high or if that number is incredibly low, you might need to take substantive action. However, there are also cases that you need to consider where action is required, where the similarity index looks fine. Now, the first question that almost inevitably staff want to know is, what is an acceptable similarity index? What is the number, Shanali? And unfortunately, what I have to say is that what is a reasonable number varies. And it varies on the basis of elements such as what is your discipline, what kind of assignment was this, how long was this assignment, have you set this assignment multiple times before, have you directed students to the same kinds of resources in terms of identifying this assignment, because or in terms of submitting this assignment, because all of those kinds of factors are likely to impact on the shape of the similarity index. So on your screen at the moment, there are 5 cases that I would like you to consider, because they're cases that you might need to intervene with in some way. So if on the basis of your similarity index, you have a very high similarity index. Let's say you've got a student and they return a similarity index of somewhere in the 80s, so like an 80% similarity. That's quite disturbingly high. And what you might be sitting with there is you might be sitting with a case of malicious plagiarism. And that is that the student has actively and deliberately copied work from some other context. And in those cases of malicious plagiarism, you would need to behave punitively. Okay, so you would need to call the student in, have a conversation with them, or email them and alert them to the fact that they have a very high similarity index and that this matches perhaps another student in the course or a student from a previous year. And you have a very strong and confident belief that the student has actively copied someone else's work, then you might need to have that conversation and then consider some form of punitive intervention. What that punitive intervention looks like varies a little bit across UCT. In some cases, there's a strongly developmental angle. So perhaps in a first year course, lecturers might give the student a warning, send them off to a tutor or to a writing consultant in the department or to somebody at the writing center to get a little bit of support and advice for how to work with paraphrasing their own document. Or the lecturer might have a workshop in the class and invite a number of students to work on their writing skills so that we avoid that copy and paste mentality. Okay, but what the what the punitive intervention for the malicious plagiarism looks like is likely to vary. It might be developmental, as I've said, or it might be altogether more on the side of a kind of punitive or legal response, almost where the student has to go through the HOD and through then onto some kind of academic exclusion process or to some kind of academic censure process based on the particular degree or extent of the problem that you've experienced with them. So that's the one case you might see. I do want to emphasize that that tends to be like the malicious plagiarism cases, while they do exist, are not the only cases that throw up really high similarity scores. We have had situations where we have very high similarity indexes for no good reason that we can identify. And that can be a kind of a technical error on behalf of the tool itself. And so if a student comes to you and you're like, I don't understand why the student's similarity score is as high as it is based on the tool itself, please flag that with the help desk as a query, because we have on occasion had those very strange technical errors that produce very high similarity scores, but there is no apparent clear instance of plagiarism at all. The other kind of student that might end up with quite a high similarity index is a student who's having academic literacy difficulties, specifically in relation to the idea of paraphrasing complex texts in their own words. So these would be students who would cut and paste a lot and who would probably diligently quote correctly. So they would insert their inverted commas, they would put in the in-text referencing, they would put it into the reference list, but because Turnitin still looks at those instances of direct quotation, they end up with quite a high similarity index. And that is a student who very much requires some form of developmental intervention as opposed to any kind of punitive intervention or technical intervention. But again, we leave this to your discretion because it is very different when a student has these experiences at first year than when they have these experiences at, say, honors or master's level. And so those are things that we might want to consider very carefully when we decide how to respond to high similarity indexes. And consider our context and the text and so on in front of you. The next case that can cause us some difficulties is what we think of as a false negative. So sometimes we've had lecturers who'll say to us, I'm looking at this particular text and this is not the student's text. In comparison to everything else that the student has done for me this year, I see that this is not their text. It sounds nothing like the thing they wrote in class, for example. It sounds absolutely nothing like the test that we wrote together. So in those cases, we would consider that there was some kind of false negative. There are a couple of situations that can arise in a false negative. One is a scenario where a student has submitted a text written by somebody else. Okay, so that's your contract cheating type element. And in some cases, that may be an AI. Okay, so in our current context, we have to consider, is the right of the student? If it is not the student, is it another human being or is it an artificial intelligence of some kind? So those will produce false negatives on the similarity index. We have also had students do interesting things like change all the O's in a document to a particular kind of O with a little dash through it, but they've changed it over in the background, or they've inserted tiny, tiny, tiny little letters in white, and that messes with Turnitin's ability to identify that this is not an original text. And so there are ways for people to get around the Turnitin matching issue. So sometimes we land up with false negatives, and whether we land up whether you decide to pursue those punitively or developmentally will depend on the nature of the case involved. And then the other case where we sometimes land up with really low, surprisingly low similarity index scores are cases where the student has the kinds of grammatical difficulties that produces sentences that are not, that just have errors, like persistent typing errors, persistent grammar errors, and that interrupts again Turnitin's ability to identify that as a matched text. Okay, so those are the cases that we might worry about overall. And then over here, I want to just point you in the direction to the fact that cases that we don't worry about might sometimes have relatively high similarity indexes, or they might have relatively low similarity indexes. They might still benefit from some kind of developmental intervention if their similarity index is a little on the high side, but it is not always required. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second, stop sharing my screen, and I'm just going to ask if there are any particular questions or queries that anyone may have with regards to any of those cases, and if there's anything that you would like to just check in about before I show you um, a Turnitin report. Sorry, I'm just pulling my Turnitin report in the back while we see if there are any questions or queries that anyone particularly wants answered. Okay, I'm not hearing any queries or questions, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up a Turnitin report very quickly, so that I can show you a little bit of what that might look like. Folks, I'm not going to show you the whole of the report because I do want to show you an actual real one. So if you would give me just a moment or two to get my screen setting right so that we don't land up seeing things that we don't necessarily want to. Just a sec, colleagues. Okay. Apologies, this is just doing things a little bit slowly right now. Be with you in a second. Hmm. Okay, one sec, folks, and I will be back with you very, very, very shortly. Um, I was going to pull a piece of text up onto the screen that I can share without causing any hiccups. One second, folks. Right. Okay, I'm so sorry. My Turnitin is doing something a little bit odd in the background and I cannot mask the elements that I want to. So what I'm going to do rather is I'm going to simply do a share screen with a slide rather than letting you necessarily look at the presentation, at the item itself, but I can still share that with you as a slide. So let's go there. Okay, all right. So I want to just point out to you what the different tools are with regards to this, and to make it clear how that works. So in the background here, kind of blurred out, is a student text, okay? And what you will see is that you will see that that number is your similarity index, okay? So this is when you click on a Turnitin report, you will get that similarity index there. If you click on this or on this item here, so either of these two icons, it will open up an additional panel on the right-hand side, which I'm not going to be able to do right now, unfortunately. And that will let you see all of the sources that go into making up that particular text. And this is where, unfortunately, Turnitin requires that you really exert your discretion as a grader, as a staff member. So when you click on these individual items, what will happen is you will simply get a list of um, sources that match your particular case on the screen. And what you will need to do is you will need to glance at those sources and identify whether or not um, there is a strong likelihood of the student being able to access that source in order to simply copy and paste it. So this number on its own isn't a very useful number for establishing has my student copied and pasted, unless this is something like a ridiculously large amount, sort of over 50 or 60%. Unless it's well over the halfway mark, the number on its own is unlikely to help you to make a choice. What you would need to do is you click on that number or click on the list, the sources list next to it, and that will give you a set of individual items that allow you to say, yes, my student might have had access to this to copy it, or no, they're unlikely to have done that. And that's a really important step in figuring out whether or not you want to make any interpretations about how a student created a particular text. The last bit that I want to talk about very quickly is Turnitin and AI. So Turnitin itself acknowledges that there is potential for false positives from its AI detection tool. The AI detection tool looks very, very similar to the similarity matching tool in that it produces a number for you. Um, Things that we need to be very, very cautious about in the South African context. First of all, research indicates that students who have English as a second language tend to be flagged for AI plagiarism at higher rates than native English speakers. And that often is because the variation in language structure tends to be less than that of native English speakers in a higher education context. And so we need to be really careful about any claims that are made around the objectivity of these tools to identify AI users. So we need to be just very, very aware that these tools are not being objective. They're just using a particular lens for identifying these things. Additionally, students can often use AI generators themselves to subvert the AI checker. So you can ask an AI tool, I'm thinking here, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, to generate a particular text for you, and then prompt them to use more complex language or prompt them to write this like a particular author. And it will do that for you. And so we need to be very careful about any claims that we make about or any interpretations we make about student text based on the AI generator, AI detector in Turnitin. So what we need to know ultimately is how those AI detectors work. And at the moment, there are two markers that they use for deciding whether or not a text is likely to have been generated by an AI. One is perplexity, and perplexity in this instance is the complexity of the language that is being used. And the second one is this term called the burstiness of sentences. Normal writers will write short and long sentences interchangeably. AI generators tend to produce sentences that are of very similar lengths and very similar structures. So if we're going to use AI detectors to try to understand or to try to identify when students are using AI generators, we need to just be aware that these are the two markers that they use for deciding whether or not a student might have plagiarized or might have used an AI generator. There are a couple of strategies we can use around this. One of them is to simply ask for longer text. So AI generators and AI detectors, my apologies, the AI detector and Turnitin specifically, works better for longer texts. So anything above 300 words is likely to return you a better level of accuracy than a shorter text. Secondly, we might want to think about multiple strategies, such as making comparisons trying out another AI detection tool, having a conversation with the student, critically having a conversation with the student. If the student indicates that yes, they have in fact used an an AI generator of some kind, we could offer them a second chance to write that under a different set of circumstances, and for a really nice set of principles for how to work with AI and student writing, I would strongly recommend that you look at the UCT staff guide for a fairly detailed outline on how to do that. I don't think we're going to have time to get into it today. So, folks, I think I'm going to pause there, and it's unfortunately just before 2, and I'm wondering if there are any pressing questions that we might want to have responses to before we wrap up for today. Okay, thank you. All right, Karen, go for it.
So with regards to the AI detection, is that possible on Amatuba at the moment or not? I
Yes.
can't remember. Was that in the settings as well?
It is in the settings. It actually comes to you. It's not something that we can set individually, unfortunately. It's determined by current practice with the institution. So if I want to double check, my understanding is that at the moment we have it on, but that we are asking people to use it very, very cautiously. For any kind of interpretation or any kind of punitive claim. I'm just double checking whether it is still in place. I think it is. Yeah, it is very much still in place on the current version of Turnitin. So when you get your Turnitin report, it is the last item that you see on the Turnitin report.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. But again, use with caution. Yeah. Okay, colleagues, are there any other questions? In that case, folks, we will wrap up. Thank you so much, everybody, for your attendance today. If you have any further questions, they can either come to me, or alternatively, the best place to start is the SILT help desk if they are queries with regards to settings or anything of that nature. If it's with regards to perhaps um, designing a work process with regards to Turnitin with your students, if you contact me, I'll put you in contact with somebody in the language development group. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Hope you have a lovely day. Take care. If there are no further questions, we will wrap up for the day.